Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Silver Wolf level 999. Our favorite gamer who now relies on her super cool god mode to deal massive damage.
I'll be discussing her kit, builds, lightcones, and possible themes. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information shown is from the creator experience server, so some things could still change when her banner drops.
Let's first start with Wolfie's regular basics, which just deals damage. Nothing really too special, I just wanted to showcase the animation. While her skill is an AoE that provides 5 punchline every time you use it, but if you're running her with her best teammates, there is a chance you won't get to use it often. With those out of the way, we can start looking at her unique resource, which is called Hidden MMR, which has a max of 300 points, and it is required for her god mode and some crit bonuses, with you gaining 0.4% crit rate per point of hidden MMR she has. But when she reaches or already has 100% crit rate, the remaining MMR will give 0.8% crit damage per point instead, which of course is neat for teams that can generate lots of MMR for Silver Wolf. Speaking of which, there are multiple ways to generate MMR. First of all, you gain 1 MMR for every point of punchline gained from any source, whether it's your units, enemies, or stage buffs. While the second is from her regular Elation skill, which just gives 15 MMR points without dealing damage. But if combined with Yao Guang or the EMC's ults to spam it, it can end up generating tons of MMR. And finally, the last way to generate MMR is with her A4 and A6 passives, with her A4 passive giving a certain amount of MMR points depending on the number of punchlines taken into account when triggering her Elation skill, with you gaining 20 additional points of MMR if her Elation skill used 20 or more punchlines, and 20 more on top of it if the Elation skill used 40 or more punchlines, giving a total of 40 MMR points from this passive alone, or up to 55 MMR when counting the ones gained from her Elation skill. As for her A6 passive, it just gives 20 MMR points upon entering her god mode, which of course is neat for more damage. On that note, her ultimate, which consumes 60 MMR to use, activates her god mode player state, which does a lot of things. First of all, upon entering the state, it gives her a 100% action advance for an instant turn, makes her immune to crowd control debuffs, gives her access to an enhanced basic and Elation skill, and finally activates a special zone. Now when Silver Wolf has certified banger, every time an ally consumes 1 SP, the zone has a chance to trigger her special top loot box, which looks like the Mario Kart item box, dealing a 90% Elation damage AoE spread equally among all enemies. It also has a chance to randomly trigger one of 3 effects. The first of which is a big flipping sword, indicated by a sharpness 255 Minecraft sword, which deals true damage to the enemy with the highest HP equal to 20% of the damage dealt during that instance. Second is Kaboom Explosion, which is indicated by Zig's Bomb, which recovers 2 skill points. And finally, Funky Munch Bean, who is just Blue Pac-Man, which just gives 3 punchlines every time it's triggered. Now, it's also worth noting that the initial chance to trigger the loot box via SP consumption is 100%. But after each trigger, the chance to trigger the next loot box goes down to 20% of the current chance. So it starts at 100%, then goes down to 20%, then 4%, then 0.8%, and so on and so forth. So most likely you'll only trigger 2 to 3 loot boxes even when consuming lots of SP with someone like Sparksy. That is of course until you can reset the rates, which you can do with her enhanced Elation skill or by re-entering god mode after it deactivates. On that note, for her enhanced Elation skill, it's a 6-hit bounce attack with each hit dealing 90% Elation damage to one random enemy. Plus, just like I said, it also resets the initial chance of triggering her loot box back to 100%. Now for her enhanced basic, which is not only full of media, gaming, and Honkai references, but it also does a lot of things. First of which, it deals 240% imaginary Elation damage split evenly into 100 bounces targeting random enemies. However, after a certain amount of bounces, the attack pauses so you can trigger her loot box. Now this loot box has pretty much the same effects as I mentioned earlier, but it's worth mentioning that when Silver Wolf triggers them, they have a different and cooler animation. But after triggering her loot box 3 times and finishing all 100 bounces, Silver Wolf will then use a Hersher of Reason-like finisher, dealing 100% elation damage split evenly among all enemies to end her enhanced basic. However, if all enemies die before the finisher, 100 bounces, and 3 loot boxes get triggered, the skill will end until new enemies respawn, after which Silver Wolf gets an extra turn to immediately use her finisher and the remaining number of bounces and loot boxes. Now there are 2 things to note. First, for every 60 points of MMR she has, the damage dealt during her enhanced basic increases by 15% of the original damage dealt and can stack up to 2 times for a 30% buff at 120 points of MMR. And finally, in accordance to her talent, after using her enhanced basic 3 times, her God mode state ends and clears all of her current hidden MMR stacks. As for other miscellaneous stuff in her kit, her talent also has the usual Elation unit clause that enables her enhanced basic, skill, and normal basic to deal elation damage when she has certified banger. While her A2 trace is her main way of getting elation, with it giving her 50% elation when she reaches 160 speed. And for every 1 speed above 160, she gets an additional 2% elation, with the passive accounting for up to 100 additional speed. It's also worth noting that she has a global passive, which just grants the firewall buff for all allies when they're about to be affected by a crowd control debuff. This effect makes them immune to crowd control debuffs for 1 turn and can only trigger once per enemy wave. Now for her technique, in the overworld she summons Pac-Man and every surrounding enemy enters that terrified state, after which Pac-Man hunts down enemies and just like Acheron, instantly defeats them without any battling, with it consuming 1 technique point upon eating an enemy. However, if you enter combat while it's present, it triggers the funky Bean Munch version of her loot box. And each wave, it deals an instance of elation damage that takes into account a fixed 99 points of certified banger. But for talent prio, level up her ult, basics, talent, and elation skill with equal priority, and finally, her normal skill. She pretty much uses everything, so level them all up, aside maybe from her normal skill. Since if you're running her with her best teammates who could build MMR for her ult super fast, there is a huge chance that you won't even get to use it too much. However, if you're not, then maybe you can level up her skill.
With her kit out of the way, we can talk about her Eidolons.
Her E1 increases the damage taken by enemies by 20% while her zone is up, and when leaving her God mode, instead of clearing all of her MMR, she retains 20% of it instead. Overall, it's pretty nice for increasing overall team damage, while also enabling her to get her ult back faster, which of course is pretty neat. While her E2 extends all of the buffs on Wolfie by 1 turn upon entering her God mode, which of course is neat for certified banger uptime. But more importantly, for every 120 MMR points, including the initial MMR she has during her current God mode, she gains 1 extra turn and regains 1 use of her enhanced basic. Now most likely you'll only get 1 extra turn from this, since getting to 240 MMR for 2 extra turns is extremely hard to do consistently. But things like her signature and Yao Guang's and Sparksy's Eidolons can all help to get 240 MMR more consistently, especially in non-Elation Shield content. However, at that point, it starts to get pretty expensive just to get a second extra turn consistently, so I personally would recommend holding off on this Eidolon unless you already have those. But if not, even if 1 consistent extra turn is still decent, the Mindscape is simply too expensive for the value you're getting. As for her M4, it multiplies the amount of punchline used by her enhanced elation skill by 5, which of course is neat for damage, especially when paired with Sparksy. And finally, for her E6, it merry makes her enhanced basics damage by 50%, or more specifically, it's a 1.5 times increase to its damage due to Merry Make being a unique multiplier. Aside from this, all enemies that enter combat are automatically inflicted with absolute weakness, which allows them to take toughness reduction from all elements. Aside from this, it also sets their base all-type res to 0. However, if one of their elemental res is already at 0, it will be set to -20 instead, acting as a 20% res shred.
With her Eidolons out of the way, let's talk about Lightcones.
Wolfie's pretty signature grants her 18% speed, while allowing her elation damage to ignore 20% defense just by equipping it. After which, it gives 20 punchlines after she uses her ult on herself, which of course translates to 20 more initial MMR for her God mode. Just note, this effect has a max trigger count of 1, with a count resetting after using her basic 3 times. Now overall, this is a great damage amping light gun for Wolfie, especially with its Def Ignore scaling well with the Magical Girl set, and it does help with her E2 if you have it. However, the main draw to this light gun is its speed buff. It puts her at 163 speed with just speed boots alone, allowing you to go for higher speed goals like 200. Now sadly, since Elation is still relatively new, there isn't really too many alternatives for her signature. So the best free-to-play alternative is the Big Mushroom from the MOC shop for its big Elation buff and stackable Elation damage vulnerability. While the BP Cone is great too for more crit stats and a pretty big Elation buff, but it only becomes way better than the Mushroom once you get more copies of it, which is pretty expensive and it does take a lot of time.
But with her light cones out of the way, let's look at possible relics.
For relics, her best set is the ever-glorious Magical Girl, with it giving her bonus crit damage while giving her up to 20% Def Ignore if you manage to stack up 50 punchlines, which you can easily do throughout the battle. Overall, it simply enables her damage by a ton, and it gets way better if you also have other sources of defense reduction in the team. Diviner is also pretty good. Now, even if you already have a user of it on the team, she benefits greatly from the speed and crit rate buff it gives, making her easier to build. Overall, it helps you achieve higher speed goals while possibly giving more elation from her passive. However, in terms of raw damage, Magical Girl can still beat it, especially if you have other defense reduction sources. However, if you still don't have good pieces, you can use a combo of any speed in crit set as a temporary alternative. Ideally, a double speed or a speed plus crit rate is preferred just so you can get more elation from her passive. As for planar sets, currently the only elation planar is Punk Lord, and it's really the only set I can recommend for her. This is because it gives 8% elation, and Wolfie can easily get the 80% elation needed to get its full crit damage buff. Overall, it's just a set that gives her all the stats she wants to enable her to deal massive damage, and it's really the only set you should consider using for general use.
With her possible sets out of the way, let's talk about stats.
Now she has a non-existent base attack of 388 and a high base speed of 110, while her traces give her 10% elation, 19% crit rate, and 9 speed. Though it's worth noting that you can also get a variable amount of crit rate and damage depending on how much MMR you can stack, so make sure to consider all of that when building. For main stats, any crit chest is great, but crit rate is preferred for more consistent damage, and so you'll have to rely less on her MMR for consistent damage, and so it also gives her more crit damage. As for the boots, speed is literally the only thing useful, plus it does put her at 163 speed with her signature and 144 without. While for the rope and orb, the only really useful ones are HP or defense for bulk, since she doesn't need damage percent, attack, or even ER. But honestly, the main stats for these don't really matter too much, just pick whichever one has the best speed or crit value. So with that being said, for stat goals, for speed, on a minimum, her trace needs about 160, but since she converts anything past that to a pretty sizable elation buff, you can go all the way to 200. 200 speed is great for 3 turns in the first cycle, and generally dealing her damage faster and getting more transformations. Without her signature, she sits at 144 speed, so you'll need 11.2 speed or 11 to 12 speed per relic to reach 200, which is honestly unrealistic, so don't even try to go for it without her signature or you'll have a terrible time. Now with her signature putting her at 163 speed, you'll need about 7.24 speed per relic to reach 200, which is a bit easier, but you still need good substat luck, so I wouldn't push it if you end up dropping too much crit rate. Though it's worth noting that there are a lot of speed buffers that can help her reach 200 speed easier in battle. On that note, she still performs great and still clears content rather easily even without 200 speed. So for most players, I recommend to just get as much speed as you can, with 160 being the absolute minimum that you shouldn't go below. Now, since her MMR can give a lot of crit, I recommend going for around 80 to 90% crit rate so her MMR can easily get her to 100% even with a lower MMR count at the start of God mode, and so it also gives her more crit damage. I don't recommend going for lower since her MMR is a variable buff, so you shouldn't completely rely on it to get all of her crit rate. Since missing crits leads to inconsistent damage, especially when using her first enhanced basic, which would typically have a lower MMR count. But for crit damage, around 100 is good enough. Now you can get more, but she gets plenty of it from her MMR, relic set, and teammates like Spark C and the EMC. So compared to crit rate, it's not as risky to rely getting a lot of her personal crit damage from her MMR, since other crit damage sources will still ensure consistent high damage even at lower MMR levels.
But with her build out of the way, let's move on to possible teammates.
Wolfie is a DPS that prefers to be ran with other Elation units like Yao Guang, Spark C, or the EMC, since she's heavily reliant on them to build punchlines for her MMR to ultimately enable her to deal damage. So with that being said, her best team comp currently is a team with Spark C and Yao Guang, plus a flex choice of your sustain, with HOYO' being the best. Now, it's worth noting that aside from heals, HOYO' doesn't actually provide anything for Wolfie. But her attack buff is great for Spark C's damage. While her energy helps Yao Guang, Spark C, and the EMC spam more ults, which in turn helps you deal more damage and generate more MMR for Wolfie, plus you can get her for free during the patch. However, if you don't want to use her, Don Hung PT works too and is actually better at keeping your team alive. However, his main caveat is you can't make Silver Wolf his bondmate since it will tank Soul Dragon's damage due to her low base attack. So make sure to give his bondmate to someone like Sparksy who benefits more from his attack buff. In a similar vein, other sustains like Hyacinth, Ningxia, Aventurine, Gallagher, and more can all work for general sustaining. But they aren't as good as HOYO' for Wolfie's best teams. Actually, let me double back, because if you have an E2 Hyacinth, she's actually super good for the team. Mainly because she gives a pretty big 30% speed buff to the party, on top of her being able to use the HOYO'S planar to give the entire party an 8% speed buff. Now, if you don't have Sparksy, replacing her with the EMC is not as detrimental as you think. Since the EMC plus Yao Guang can still generate Wolfie's ult pretty fast, due to them giving her so much elation skills with their ults on top of their buffs, enabling her to deal massive damage even without Sparksy in the team. Now, the issue arises when you don't have Yao Guang, since it's more detrimental to replace her with the EMC than it is to replace Sparksy. Well, detrimental mainly for Sparksy. This is because the EMC is mostly a single target buffer, and since most of the damage will come from Wolfie, you want to prioritize giving her the EMC's buffs. Meaning, Sparksy, for the lack of a better gamer word, gets over. Mainly because without Yao Guang, she gets almost no buffs aside from her own, less elation skills, less thrill, lower certified banger uptime, and overall, just less damage. Which you can honestly just live with, since Sparksy dealing less damage isn't really too bad, since she still ends up dealing okay damage. But more importantly, she enables Silver Wolf to deal more than enough damage to clear content and compensate for Sparksy's lower damage, with her being able to get her ult super fast. Now, if you don't have Yao Guang and Sparksy, the drop-off in performance is noticeable. But you actually have quite a bit of choices, but it also means the EMC becomes locked to the team, otherwise you can't build Wolfie's ult. Any non-damage support like 3B for rest pens or her E1, Cypher for damage vulnerability or defense shreds, Bella or Silver Wolf again for defense shreds can all work for the third slot. While Sparkle is great for her buffs, and despite Silver Wolf being faster than her, Sparkle with her action advance helps Wolfie unload damage from her enhanced basics faster, ultimately helping you start building her next ult quicker, plus she can also use TDD. Ruan Mei can also work for her rest pen, speed buff, and E1's def ignore, which stacks nicely with Wolfie's signature and the magical girl set. But just note, her damage buff is useless for Wolfie. And finally, my favorite budget option, it's Asta, with which you can make a budget Wolfie team with the EMC and HOYO'. And this is mainly because she gives a flat 53 speed buff at E4, which translates to a 106 elation buff for Wolfie, which is just insane. On that note, you can also run a sustainless team with Wolfie as long as you also run either Yao Guang or EMC in the team. And of course, this team would allow Wolfie to clear any content due to the massive damage it enables her to do at the cost of her survivability. But that's about it. Personally, I'm definitely gonna be pulling for Wolfie and possibly E6ing her since I've been a fan of her since day one. Plus, she's literally a walking reference to every single media franchise I love. I mean, come on. She has the Strike Freedom's Wings of Light and the drill hair that is the drill that will pierce the heavens. Anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcase. I hope you enjoy, and remember, I suck at this game.